Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to this episode of Perspectives with me, your host, Abdullah. And today we're going to be talking about Islam in the West. And with me here in the studio is Idris Tawfiq. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
It's my honor to be here, Abdullah.
Thank you very much. Today we're going to introduce you. You are at the moment involved in the spread of Islam. You have a degree from Manchester University, England.
Yes.
And you were also trained as a priest, and you came to Islam how long ago exactly?
Almost 9 years, in a couple of weeks, 9 years.
Alhamdulillah. Now, before we enter into the topic of the day, which is Islam and the West, we'd like to, obviously, some of the viewers are dying to ask, how did you become a Muslim? Can you just give us a very brief outline about how, as a priest, you became a Muslim?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-Mursaleen Sayyid Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I have discovered in life that if we take time out to look back on our lives, we see that Allah has been there all the time. So people say to me, wow, what a big change. You were a priest in Rome, in the UK, and then you completely changed direction and became a Muslim. And I reply, I see no change. I just see one straight line. And I see that Allah, in all even from when I was a kid, was leading me to where I am today. So I tell people, when I was in Rome, sitting in lectures, learning about church history and the Bible and all sorts of stuff like this, I wasn't really training for the priesthood. I was training to be on this program today. That Allah's plan right from the beginning of time was that I would be here. So I left the priesthood with no plan of leaving the church. No plan. I was happy with my religion. And to cut it very short, I came to Egypt and met Muslims for the first time in my life. And then over the course of a year, people, events, circumstances, Allah pushing and shoving and pulling and holding my hand and leading me, so that after a year or so of meeting Muslims for the first time, my heart could hold out no longer, and I declared that there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger.
Thank you very much. We'd love to obviously pursue that, but
another program.
Yes, that one for another program. Now today we're going to be discussing Islam and the West,
yes.
And obviously it's very relevant to your situation. And to many, in fact, because the population of the Muslims is growing. We are now more than 1 billion in the world. We have a very high birth rate in the Muslim countries, and a lot of immigration from the Muslim countries to Europe. And obviously, the number of Muslims in Europe is growing. We've got, I think, 6 million in France officially. I think we've got about 4 million in Britain. And it's a strong trend, and it looks set to continue. So, that combined with the political situation, the spotlight has begun to turn, and we have the spotlight on the relationship between Islam and the West. Now, interestingly, given the trends, you have actually decided to stay in Egypt, with many of the Arabs desperate to go to Europe. Of course, for various reasons, but you have chosen to live in Egypt. What's brought you here, and what keeps you here?
Bismillah. Well, you see, I lived in Rome for 5 years or so, training for the priesthood in the Vatican. And the first time I came to Egypt, I fell in love with the place as being a bit like Rome, but different too, exotic. And I just find that the people here are very sweet and very kind. And I find, if the truth be told, that this is a land of real faith. That ordinary people, not just people talking. It's easy to talk. We can talk about being Muslims and about, we do this and we do that, and it's important to believe this and that. But here I find that my faith is strengthened just by ordinary people in the street. By a kid selling bananas, a man cleaning shoes. They touch my heart. So I like to say that Egypt is my base. And I travel all over the world now talking about Islam, alhamdulillah. But I keep coming back, so that my heart can be fed with this simple, good Islam.
Yeah, I have to say I have similar experiences when I go back. I really do miss.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it's the land of Islam, and particularly Egypt.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, amongst several books you've written, one of these is called Talking to Muslims in the West.
Yes.
What have you found out about the conditions, in your research of the book, what have you found out about the conditions of Muslims in the West? And is this the same in all countries?
Bismillah. The West is big. And what even is the West? Is Malaysia the West? Because Malaysia is a very developed country. When we think of the West and Islam, we think of highly developed economies, people with money, as opposed to backwardness and illiteracy. And that's when people think about Islam on the one hand and the West on the other. The West it's not a geographical term, so it could include people living in South Africa or people living in Finland. So it's not geographical.
So you've defined it according to a slightly different set of criteria.
I think so. I think I would imagine the West is more a mindset. You could have the West here in Cairo, and indeed there is the West here in Cairo, and you find many people. And I must say, I find it laughable, wanting to be Western. You know, when they've more than enough to be proud of and to rejoice in, you know. But when the television is telling Muslims all the time, though, that they're backward and that they've no history, and of course, if people aren't educated well and they don't have the words to respond, they begin to believe it. And so lots of youngsters say to me, "And I suffer. I want to travel. I want to travel to Berlin and Rome and London and New York because the streets are paved with gold and there's money everywhere and everyone lives in big villas and dressed in beautiful clothes." Well, of course, life isn't like that. Life isn't a soap opera. Life in the West is hard. You know, people have to go out to work and work hard, and it rains.
It rains.
I choose to be here because it's a land, as you say, it's the land of Islam. But in the West there are different places. America is different to the UK, to Ireland, to Australia, and they all have what I would call there's only one Islam, but they have what I would call different flavors. Yeah, there's only one Islam, but there's a different flavor to Islam in the States, to in the UK. But Muslims face a lot of trouble in these places too. It's not all good news. They face discrimination and they face a lot of nonsense from the TV and the radio and newspapers looking for someone to blame. And a point I make very often is that, you know, when the media train moves on, the spotlight will go from Islam and it'll go to something else.
It will,
You know, in Britain, for example, it was Catholics. At the turn of the 20th century, Irish Catholics were the brunt of the nation's ills. Then eventually it moved on, and then there was a period in the 70s, 80s, Sikhs wearing their turbans that were a big problem. Now it's Islam, and a lot of it I do believe in Britain, for example, in Europe, a lot of it is just purely racist. It's nothing to do with religion, really. It's to do with the colour of your skin. People ask the question in Britain, are you British or are you Muslim? Well, they never ask me that. They wouldn't dare. They can see I'm British. How dare you ask me such a question? But they'll ask it you if your background is Pakistani. So it's not so much an Islam question. It's a race question. And we need to, because a lot of this brings with it baggage that's not part of Islam either. Different cultural backgrounds bring baggage that maybe causes trouble that's not part of Islam.
Okay, now you've touched on quite a few ideas there. So I want to just draw you back to the conditions of Muslims in the Muslim countries.
Okay.
Now some say, and perhaps there is a perception that there is a certain amount of backwardness there, and you've touched on that on your book. And what exactly do you mean, and is it really true?
In a sense it is true. But you visit some countries like Malaysia. Malaysia is just a wonderful country. I was there for a tour just before Ramadan. It's highly developed. Muslims are highly professional. They're on time. They dress nicely. They're smart. They're hardworking. But in other countries, a legacy of colonialism, which has tried to suppress and repress and keep down Islam and national characteristics, has left many of these Muslim lands with problems.
So I'd like to just touch on that as well. I mean, many Muslims are sort of wary about using that as an escape, but you coming from England, you're actually saying that really is a reality.
Let's speak the truth. You know, if we're having dialogue, I'm a firm believer in dialogue, but dialogue must be honest, and dialogue is between equals. So we'll pick any country, we'll pick America, okay? Americans may want to have a dialogue with Islam. President Obama is talking about dialogue with Islam. But it must be an honest dialogue. It mustn't just be a monologue where they speak to Muslims and tell them, we want A, B, C, you must achieve this goal and this one, and you can become part of our club. No, Islam doesn't need anyone's approval. You know, Muslims are strong. Islam is very strong. It's sweet and gentle and beautiful, but it's also strong. And when we're talking about dialogue, we must admit we are like this because of A, B, and C. You know, this country we live in, not this one, but a particular country, it only exists because the British and the French drew lines in the sand and said, you are a country from now on. And they purposely built in, I strongly believe, problems that are now surfacing after so many years, you know, but they were built there to divide and to keep Muslims at each other's throats.
Yeah, not easy at all, not easy. Now, in your book and your research, what did you find out about the conditions of the Muslims in the West, in your talking to Muslims in the West? What did you find out about their conditions?
Well, again, you see, brother, there are, pick any country. Because Muslims in Canada, for example, in the United States, are completely different. It's a different situation altogether to France and Germany. Let's be honest, many of the Muslims in France and Germany and Italy at the present time came because they were looking for a new, better life. And they managed to sneak in over the mountains or arrive in a boat and brought with them all their baggage and a lot of their problems and no money.
And their children.
And their children and their families. And they brought a lot of problems. And this is partly why Muslims in France, in Marseille, in the south, for example, you have these right-wing groups who are vehemently anti-Islam because of social problems. Now, Islam in Canada, for example, Canada's a long way away. And to get to Canada, you have to get on a plane, and you need a visa saying that you've got money. And I've spoken to ambassadors here in Cairo, and they say, the Canadian ambassador, for example, told me, he said Muslims in Canada are better educated than most Canadians. You know, they're better off than many Canadians.
It's a very strong community, incidentally.
Very strong, wonderful community too. And in America too. So Canada and America, they don't have many of the social problems that Islam faces in parts of Europe. Ireland, the Muslims began to go to Ireland in the 50s to train as doctors, as engineers. So they came from Saudi Arabia, from Malaysia, from Libya, and many of them stayed on. And the people of Ireland didn't know anything about Islam, but they knew that these foreigners were providing a service to a poor country.
And I've heard the similar thing, actually. Very good reports from Ireland and their respect for Islam over there. Okay, just stop you there. We're going to go to a break.
Sure.
Thank you for watching. We'll be back after the break in about one or few minutes. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.